Just gonna make myself comfortable. Okay, so tonight I'm going to tell you a shameful story about mould. I used to have a bit of a reputation for having particularly low standards when it comes to what's considered normal, hygienic, edible food. I've crossed the threshold of mould a few times. And in case you were wondering what the threshold of mould is, it's a term that I coined which determines whether a piece of food that you forgot about is salvageable from that purple, spotted, fluffy, alien-looking creature that got there first. We've all been there, right? But how you dealt with the situation is probably what separates you from me. I used to hate throwing away food. It made my heart cry a little bit. Seriously. When I used to work in a restaurant in Australia, occasionally a waitress would return to the kitchen with a plate of half-eaten food, and I'd just tell her, just leave it there, I'll deal with it. And after she was gone, I'd dive right in and not look back. I was basically a human garbage disposal. So yeah, I used to think I was like preparing my constitution and immune system for an apocalyptic future of dumpster diving. So yeah, I think I definitely have the constitution for that now. So I feel like how one person deals with this topic says a lot about how you were brought up. For instance, did you live through a war, a famine, the Great Depression? Well, I've lived through none of those things, but my mother certainly has. She grew up in a family of 5 in a tiny little dust bowl town called Sandstone, smack bang in the middle of the West Australian desert. They were poor, so nothing was wasted, and there was no electricity, so no refrigeration. I think I would have been pretty comfortable with these circumstances. So it was no surprise growing up with my mum instilling her virtues that she'd learned upon me and my brother. She always used to say at the dinner table, "You're not leaving until you've finished everything on your plate." And I have a memory that sticks in my mind of making a sandwich when I was a kid, and I discovered that there was a bit of mould on the bread. "Mom, the bread's mouldy!" "Just cut it off and pretend you never saw it," she said. "Thanks, Mom." So I did, and look at me now. So when I first moved out of home in my early 20s, I got a bit of a shock about how expensive being independent is. Like all of a sudden, on top of my weekly budget for recreational drugs and alcohol, came all this boring, expenses previously unbeknown to me while living at my parents' cushy castle. Things like bills and rent and that little strainy thing you put in the sinkhole. Clearly, I needed to start making cutbacks somewhere. And then it hit me, thinking like a typical 20-year-old. Food, clearly an unnecessary extravagance. So I set about cutting back on my weekly food budget by looking through one of those Feed the Family for $5 magazines. And that's where I discovered the recipe that changed my life. Well, not really, but it was for pumpkin lentil dal. It satisfied all the criteria. It was tasty, it was culturally interesting, and most importantly, cheap. If there's one country that knows how to feed a shitload of people on a budget, it's India. So I set about making my first batch of pumpkin lentil dal sometime in the Australian winter. And just so you know, the Australian winter is much milder than Montreal. We have no need to use the term arse-tearing cold. So, yeah. The other thing about Australia is we haven't fully yet grasped the concept of insulating our houses. So more often than not, inside your house will be as cold as outside or colder. So that particular day that I made my first batch of pumpkin lentil dal, standing at the stove, shivering, it's about 5 to 10 degrees, more or less what's in the fridge. Hey, why don't I just leave it on the stove? So I turned off the gas and walked away, quite pleased with myself, dipping into it every other day for sustenance, and I had cut back on my weekly food budget, and there were no obvious side effects. When? So fast forward a few years, when I first returned from my first soul-shaking trip to India. A friend of mine, a travel agent, booked the entire trip at mates rates prices, so to repay her, I decided I was going to invite her over for an extravagant Indian feast. Of course, the pumpkin lentil dal, which had racked up years of success by this point, made it to the menu. I was extremely prepared for this dinner party and made the curry 3 days in advance so that flavours could really develop. Only this time, I paid no attention to what season it was. Summer. Late summer. And late summer in Perth can be particularly brutal. We get almost an entire month of hot, dry, brain-numbing heat, which is basically the perfect breeding conditions for mould. So it was no surprise when my housemate Nikki curiously lifted up the lid of the pot on the day of the dinner party to discover I'd spawned an entire civilization. I'd not only crossed the threshold of mould, I'd done an Olympic athlete-sized jump over it. I panicked. What was I going to do? I told my friend I was going to prepare an entire Indian feast. I only had time to make one more dish. And then my mother's voice came in my head. Just cut it off and pretend you never saw it. Saw it. Saw it. Thanks, Mum. So I hastily scraped off the layer of fuzz, threw it in a Tupperware container and threw it back in the fridge, pretending I'd never seen it. And then, before my friends arrived, I threw it in the microwave, nuked the living shit out of it, basically liquefying any texture out of the dish, and planned to serve it up. And then moments before my friends arrived, my boyfriend Colin told me, it's not too late to pull the plug, you know. You know, they'll still be your friends if you don't serve it, but they might not survive to be your friends if you do. I chose to ignore the risk and served it up anyway. Amazingly, this is probably the most scary thing about the story, Colin and I still went ahead and ate it. And I'll never forget the expression on my friend's face when that mouldy curry hit her lips and the corners of her mouth went in other directions. She was very polite. And so a small part of me felt bad for needlessly subjecting my friend to this mouldy food. But then the rest of me was just taken over by this sick intrigue and fascination, kind of like a crazy scientist might feel when conducting some kind of insidious experiment. Will my friend be honest and tell me my curry looks and tastes like shit? Or will she keep quiet when her shit comes out looking like curry? But amazingly, they left. A few days later, her usual chirpy Facebook status updates weren't replaced for calls out for remedies for gastro. Just a thank you for the dinner party and a promise to reciprocate. So when the time came around for her to have us over to her place for dinner, she put on an amazing vegetarian feast, which had no traces of mould to be found, or to be tasted, who knows. And her sisters Beck and Joanna were present, and somehow, amazingly, the conversation gravitated to mould. The sisters recounted a story when they were younger where one of them knowingly fed the other one a piece of mouldy toast. How could you do that, you disgusting human being? And then I just froze. Oh my god, like this is a perfect Seinfeld moment. How could I let it pass? So I piped up, you know, once I served some friends some mouldy curry. Colin, in his seat, turned his head, eyes wide open. Yeah, they ate it and they never found out. Colin, by this point, was tremoring. Was he going to give away my mouldy, shameful secret? So my friend said, Miles, how could you do that? That's disgusting. Yeah, I felt pretty bad, but, you know, they survived, so it's all good. Jeez, they said. That's, What followed was a very long, awkward silence. I think they were shocked and speechless, to say the least. But eventually, the conversation moved on, and they never found out. So, yes, I'd just like to say that I have been punished for my mouldy ways since then. One time, I was looking into the fridge at my housemate Nikki's shelf. She had amazing things because she actually had a real job. And there was a piece of chorizo that I saw transform from red, juicy, delicious slush into cold, hard, purple, mouldy over the course of a couple of weeks. until eventually she relinquished ownership to me, which I quickly and promptly ate uncooked and paid for severely with 3 days of arse-tearing diarrhea. One of the first times I've called in sick to work with gastro, and I've legitimately had gastro. So, yes, I'd just like everyone in the audience to know, particularly my friends who I may end up cooking dinner for sometime in the future, that I have learned from my mouldy ways, my sinful bad habits, and I now know the importance of putting good, nourishing things in your body. And it's not the end of the world to relinquish a piece of food to the worms in the compost heap. Thank you.